Is everybody ready for me to go ahead and get started? All right. So welcome to day one. This is our plenary session. I'm going to provide sort of an overview of the history of Whistleblowers of America, what we do, and then we're going to have our first panel on research related to whistleblower retaliation. So welcome to our first annual Workplace Promise Institute conference organized by Whistleblowers of America. We hope that the next 2 days helps you get started on your journey to become a certified whistleblower protection advocate, or to better understand what whistleblowers go through and what it's like to survive retaliation. I want to first begin by thanking our volunteer staff who have been our planning committee for the last few months. First, our conference chair, Christian Greene, who you've all probably been communicating with, Paul Pearson, another frequently communicated person who is the founder of Running Name LLC, and he's done an amazing job by recruiting several very talented interns. So we've had Valpreet Gauraya, Christina Salazar, Rachel Cook, Chiyun Kim, and Mathayo Angel, and Kim Young McLear for being our WPI Giraffe Award Committee chairperson. She's done an amazing job, and you'll see more of that later today. We've also had some amazing sponsors that I would love to thank. And we should have we'll have a slide that will show you everything, who they are. Our lead sponsor for this event was Mahari & Skelet, and then our silver sponsor was Whistleblower. Our bronze sponsor was Feds Protection, Joe Carson, National Workplace Bullying Coalition, David Evans Law Firm. And our winner circle has been Kevin Ellis, Sandra Brown, and just this morning, Julie Reed. So thank you all for supporting us and getting us to this day. Without you, we wouldn't be here. We couldn't have made this possible. So thank you. And we've had several other donors who have wished to remain anonymous, and we're grateful for them as well. And I just wanted to remind our sponsors that if you are owed a book, you will still be getting those in the mail. We didn't have time to get them out to you before the conference, but they'll make a fine follow-up gift to you in the near future, and you'll be receiving that in the mail shortly. So, and it's not too late to donate if you are interested in still supporting us. If you value our peer training, our networking, our advocacy activities, we need our community for mutual support and assistance. We are a tax-deductible contribution. Every donation makes a difference, and you can even donate to us on Amazon Smile. We wanted to keep this event virtual and accessible, so every employee around the world had the possibility to join us today, and we didn't want to charge a fee. But even a $10 donation would help make a difference in keeping the workplace safe for everyone. If you look at the chat, you will find the links to our donation pages. And just for a few announcements and some housekeeping, we will keep a live chat so participants can network and find information as we go along. We wanted to make this as interactive as possible for a virtual live event. We miss seeing you all in person, so we're trying to do our best to keep that peer relationship and connections going as much as possible. Your program has the contact information on each of the speakers, so that if you want to connect with them after the session, there is a way to do so. And then during the opening sessions for each break, you can chat with Christian Greene about the certification program. She'll be available to answer questions. And remember that attendance for the 2 days or 10 hours qualifies you to apply for certification. So I would encourage you to take a look at the Whistleblowers of America website and the qualifications for certification to complete your package. There's, again, the link in the chat. Tonight is our night of giraffery. So please join us, tune in at about 5:30 Eastern Standard Time to learn about our first WPI Giraffe Award recipients and enjoy a giraffe drink with us. The Giraffe Awards will recognize those whistleblowers who have stood tall and stuck their necks out to protect others from harm in spite of criticism and retaliation. We will have rooms for special interest groups and interactions for networking. So hopefully we can get that function to work so you can join us later and we can enjoy some interactions. So welcome to the premiere of our Workplace Promise Institute. This is the first event that Whistleblowers of America has sponsored. We have chosen this week because of the significance between Labor Day and Patriots Day on September 11th. Because whistleblowers are honest and ethical employees who were just doing their jobs when they saw some aspect of wrongdoing and reported it in the United States. We've celebrated Labor Day for about 140 years as trade unions and labor workers united and spoke out. We have them to thank today for better working conditions, safety standards, and fair wages and benefits. Then, on Saturday, we will memorialize the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks that killed almost 3,000 people from nations all over the world, who, for the most part, were doing their jobs in the towers, at the Pentagon, and on airplanes. And we remember them. This week is also the beginning of Suicide Prevention Month. Whistleblowers of America was created in recognition that a workplace is toxic. It can lead to undue stress, depression, anxiety, addiction, and ultimately suicide. We have worked with the House Veterans Affairs Committee and the family of Dr. Chris Kirkpatrick, who died by suicide after suffering from retaliation and whistleblowing the VA medical center he worked for. We honor him. There are so many like him every day that face similar emotional turmoil. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in America and the 4th leading killer among working-aged adults. Over 1 million people a year attempt suicide. So while we are at this conference for the next 2 days, over 250 people are likely to die by suicide. And studies show that extreme work stress and adverse working conditions, along with underemployment and unemployment, are associated risk factors for suicide. WOA believes that peer support enables individual resiliency and help-seeking behavior, and getting organizations to make a workplace promise, which is what the next 2 days will be all about. We need whistleblower protection advocates because we need to have a scope of practice and a common language, a lexicon, a taxonomy to describe and respond to those adverse working conditions. So the agenda for the Workplace Promise Institute was specifically designed to train people to become WPAs, because resilience, decision-making, problem-solving, and help-seeking are all things that whistleblowers need along their journey. We need to own our own army so that we can fight back. There is a history and a philosophy to understanding whistleblowers, and we're going to get into more of that today. We've tried to understand the propensity for someone to become a whistleblower. When we've asked the question, we have found the answer dates back to ancient Greece, when Aristotle proposed a school of thought related to human nature, virtue, character, and courage. The epics by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are actually studies in human nature that psychiatrist Jonathan Shea modernized when he looked at the undoing of character in the combat veterans he treated and the betrayal of trust that they felt as a moral injury that led to the coexisted with post-traumatic stress disorder. And when we look at the laws of quitam, which is Latin, roughly means he who sues on behalf of himself and the king, those date back to Roman and Anglo-Saxon laws. Even then, there was a belief that the community had eyes and ears that could benefit the Commonwealth while rewarding the patriot. In the United States, the First Amendment of the Constitution exists primarily because of Revolutionary War sailors who brought their grievances against their command to Congress. They reported the abuse of British prisoners. The commander retaliated against them and had them jailed. When Congress found out, the commander was sanctioned and himself jailed. In response to this experience with retaliation, the Continental Congress in 1778 passed the first whistleblower legislation in the new nation that made it the duty of all persons in the service of the United States, as well as other inhabitants thereof, to give the earliest information to Congress or other proper authority of any misconduct, frauds, or misdemeanors committed by any officer or persons in the service of these states, which may come to their knowledge. Today, we celebrate Whistleblower Day on July 30th to commemorate this history, the day that original legislation was signed. As the Civil War raged on, the Union Army was suffering from unscrupulous contractors selling tainted food and bad supplies, like sawdust instead of gunpowder. Congress passed the False Claims Act, and President Lincoln signed the law to encourage whistleblowing and accountability. And over the decades, there have been multiple laws that exist today because of the recognition that corruption and discrimination can be prevented. We saw the Lloyd-Lafayette Act of 1912, the National Labor Retaliation Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Consumer Product Safety Act, and OSHA, Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989, its enhancement in 2012 that prohibits retaliation. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act is a privacy act. We fight weaponized diagnoses through HIPAA. Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, some people call that. The No Fear Act and Dodd-Frank, the accountability and transparency that was required to encourage right doing. So, and Whistleblowers of America is a member of the Make It Safe Coalition Steering Committee, and we have worked with our sister organizations across multiple sectors to play a role in government accountability and represent the voices of employees who come to us for support and advocacy. We are proud to join a current effort to pass a new Whistleblower Protection Improvement Act, which could be a sea change legislation currently before Congress. The bill would address the need to protect federal whistleblowers from retaliatory investigations, protect their confidentiality and identity, and give them access to jury trials, which would afford them the same rights as other types of whistleblowers. This would be a significant change because federal whistleblowers are currently the only labor market group that does not have the right to a jury trial. Without the access, federal employees are at the mercy of the Office of Special Counsel or the Merit System Protection Board, which has lacked a quorum for about 4 years now and faces a backlog of over 3,000 cases. This is justice delayed, justice denied. So we need bipartisan and bicameral support to get the powerful new legislation to President Biden to sign. Federal whistleblowers act to protect the health and safety of every American and every taxpayer who foots the bill for fraud in this country. On the international stage, other countries are bypassing the American laws, some, that protect employees. So we need to keep pace and contribute to the literature and the research that helps heal employees who suffer retaliation, harassment, and discrimination in the workplace, overcome their adversity. In a moment, Representative Jackie Speier will be joining us via video to share the latest from Congress. But I wanted to take a quick moment and review the agenda and some of our key highlights. So as I mentioned this morning, we will be talking about the research that has been ongoing. And then our first panel after that will be about the laws, the legislation. We'll hear from some of the really great legal experts that have agreed to join us today. We will also have an introduction to peer support today and on addressing the psychosocial issues. And then we'll have our evening of giraffery. And then the next day, we start with a review of compliance. We'll also be talking about how to talk to the media and to Congress over the next 2 days. So we have a part 1 and part 2 about how to share your narrative. And finally, I will be talking about the Workplace Promise campaign and what we have lined up for the following year. So before we begin with our panelists this morning, we have a special welcoming message from Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who currently serves as the U.S. Representative for California's 14th Congressional District, serving in Congress since 2008. In 1978, while working as an aide to Congressman Leo Ryan and investigating human rights violations by Jim Jones and his followers in Guyana, she survived 5 gunshot wounds while Representative Ryan was assassinated during the Jonestown massacre. Some of us may remember that. The tragedy did not stop her and only furthered her into a career of public service. She has served in California State Assembly and the Senate before becoming a Congresswoman. She has dedicated her life to eliminating government corruption while working to strengthen America's national and economic security. She even called out Congress as a breeding ground for a hostile work environment and advocated for more sexual harassment training while advancing the Me Too movement and introduced the I Am Vanessa Guillon Act. She has been fearless fighter for women's equality, LGBTQA rights, and of course, whistleblower rights, championing the legislation she will discuss today. So join me in welcoming via video, Congresswoman Jackie Speier.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first annual Workplace Promise Institute training. I'd like to thank the Whistleblowers of America for organizing this important training to ensure heroic individuals who come forward and blow the whistle on misconduct have the support they need and deserve. Whistleblowers have long served as the moral compass for Congress and our country, while saving billions of tax dollars each year. It takes bravery and conviction to come forward because far too often speaking out results in drastic retribution and retaliation for those who muster the courage to do what's right. The biggest beneficiary of whistleblowing is the American people, who see criminal wrongdoing and the waste of taxpayer dollars exposed and wrongdoers held accountable. There's been no greater recent example of that benefit than during the COVID-19 pandemic, during which whistleblowers have saved $2.2 billion in taxpayer money in fiscal year 2020 alone. For this reason, I was proud to reintroduce my resolution recognizing July 30 as National Whistleblower Appreciation Day. However, it's incumbent on Congress to do much more than celebrate these truth tellers. We must do all we can to strengthen whistleblower protection laws. That's why Congressman Raskin, Senator Warren, and I reintroduced the COVID-19 Whistleblower Protection Act to ensure COVID relief funds aren't pillaged and plundered, and that those who witness waste, fraud, and abuse have the confidence to come forward. That includes access to jury trials when administrative relief is not timely and protecting whistleblowers' identities, a major issue under the previous administration. I am also a proud co-sponsor of the bipartisan Whistleblower Protection Improvement Act, which will establish new procedures to ensure employees receive timely relief for retaliation claims and extend critical protections to federal employees in the Public Health Service, the Commissioned Officers Corps of NOAA, and non-career senior executive service employees. Recently, I joined my colleagues, including Representative Hank Johnson, Norma Torres, and Nancy Mace, to introduce the bipartisan Judiciary Accountability Act, which will extend strong statutory rights and protections against discrimination, harassment, retaliation, and other forms of workplace misconduct in the judicial branch and provide much-needed whistleblower protections to those working in the judicial branch. We also can't forget about military whistleblowers, which is why I continue to exercise vigorous oversight over inspectors general within the Department of Defense and fight to improve protections for those in DoD with the fortitude to come forward. We know that service members who blow the whistle on misconduct and subsequently experience retribution face a higher bar to prove retaliation than civilians, which is why I am working to fix this glaring inequity. Of course, the work doesn't stop with these proposals. The training you all receive through the Workplace Promise Institute is a major part of that effort and will help ensure whistleblowers continue to come forward. So thank you to everybody here today, and a special thanks to those of you who have come forward to reveal wrongdoing and continue to serve your country and fight for what's right. Your commitment, your valor, your grit, your ethics inspires all of us. You are American heroes.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So now turning our attention to our first panel for the Workplace Promise Institute. I wanted to recap a little bit about the research on whistleblowing, and also to note that Dr. Martina Buckley was unable to join us this morning. But I wanted to take a moment and thank Dr. Buckley for her work, personally her work helping me develop the taxonomy for the toxic tactics of retaliation. Together, we have reviewed the literature, analyzed survey data from the Whistleblowers of America website, surveys that some of you may have responded to when you've clicked on our website and saw the survey. That's the one. And we've reviewed other interviews with whistleblowers that led to the Whistleblower Retaliation checklist creation that can document the aspects of what makes retaliation a serious injury through its 9 domains and toxic tactics. So, and I want to go over some of those domains today and the psychological impacts that they've had for many people. And again, we've kind of grouped these through that study, and they may not be the only tactics that some people may have experienced, but what we found was there were these primary driving factors that we thought would be really helpful to identify. So we started with gaslighting, which is defined as the manipulation of psychological means of an individual in order to cause the subject to question their own memory, perceptions, and sanity, and is often associated with bullies, psychopaths, narcissists, and emotional abusers who want to deflect their own wrongdoing and belittle or degrade the intelligence of their victims. Mary Stout wrote about that in The Sociopath Next Door. In the workplace, it is used to undermine the credibility of relators and witnesses. Mobbing occurs in the workplace when management directly or indirectly pressures other employees to collude against and inform on the activities of the whistleblower. Other terms that we've used have been flying monkey or co-conspirators or conspirator of silence. Devaluing, when employees' performance ratings are unexpectedly lowered, promotions are missed, or training opportunities are lost, when previously they were at exceptional or at least appropriate levels of valuation. Shunning ostracizes or socially alienates the employee from their team or other emotionally supportive colleagues. It thwarts their sense of belonging, purpose, and meaning, which are factors often associated with depression and suicide. Career blocking, or sometimes known as blacklisting or blackballing, occurs when an employee tries to move to another office, division, corporation, or field of practice, but their professional reputation has been so ruined, whether formally or informally, that it hinders their ability to obtain substantial gainful employment. Double binding. This is associated with mixed messages and contradictions, usually someone of greater power, so common with parents or spouses, but even a boss, to manipulate the mental status of the victim. It may feel restorative at first, but it's a trick. Accusing or countering or counter-accusing impugns the credibility of the whistleblower and assassinates their character as an honest broker of events. Retaliatory investigations or mobbing are often used to help build a counter-complaint against the whistleblower, and charges are trumped up against them for investigations, usually involving things like their performance, accountability, such as time cards, or even expense reports. Bullying and violence. Employees are emotionally, physically, and sexually harassed or abused, threatened, stalked, doxxed, cyberbullied, to include their families, to intimidate them and shut down their very allegations. So these tactics will be discussed in a book that we have due out for publication with Springer, entitled The Psychosocial Impacts of Whistleblower Retaliation, Shattering Employee Resilience, and the Workplace Promise. I'm excited about this because I hope it will be a game changer for recognizing how traumatic retaliation can be and for assessing the long-term psychosocial damage it causes. As whistleblowers, we know that the prolonged exposure to adverse working conditions, a hostile work environment, adversarial judicial proceedings, and the toxic tactics of retaliation can result in a moral injury, identity disruption, ethical dissonance, and a shattered worldview. This can lead to PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. I'm going to say that over and over again because I think it's important to reiterate just how harmful retaliation is. So whistleblower disclosures and subsequent retaliation require different strategies and interventions, and therefore the evolving research is vital to improving judicial outcomes and clinical treatments to make whole the employee suffering through a hostile work environment. So today, through our Workplace Promise Institute conference and with the discussion on research and an outlook for future research, I'm going to ask you to help me welcome the first group of panelists, and I believe Paul is going to help bring the rest of the panelists to the stage today. I think I see everybody.
Good morning. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope
Morning,
you can
Jackie.
all hear us. Good morning, and Christian. I know you're. I see you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Oh, so poor Christian has had laryngitis. So we're gonna make do, and hopefully we'll be able to hear her today. So we have a lot to discuss this morning. And by way of introduction, can you each briefly tell us about your experience in this area and why you're interested in research?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure. Why don't you go first, Ian?
We'll do this alphabetically. Hi, I'm Ian Foxley. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel from the British Army. Although my whistleblowing experience actually pertains to what I was doing about 14 years after I left the Army, when I was the program director for a defense communications contract in Saudi Arabia, working for a UK subsidiary wholly owned by Airbus Group. I was the program director for a £2 billion project to modernize all the communications for the National Guard. And I came across some strange items which raised my concerns, and as I started doing more and more digging, I got more and more concerned, and eventually went and gave my findings or concerns to a British Army team in country whose job was to assure and govern the contract. And the brigadier said, hey, you're going to have to find me the actual evidence. So I went and got the actual evidence, gave it to him, and he referred it to the Ministry of Defence, which is equivalent to your Department of Defence. And they said, give it back to the company and let them deal with the disclosure, which effectively is like handing a gun back to the murderer. And they threatened me with arrest and jail in Riyadh. In fact, a senior Saudi princess who was our HR director did that. And when the team found out about that, they got me out overnight. And I came back to UK, declared it to the Serious Fraud Office, and in fact went to the Ministry of Defence and said, if you don't do this within 5 days, then you are complicit, and I'm going to the Serious Fraud Office and the press. So I had to pressure the Department of Defence to actually do what they're meant to do. And it's been investigated and tracked for 10 years. And
what are you doing now? Tell us about your new...
Hang on, I'll just tell you the conclusion of that bit, because it triggered the investigation into Airbus, who were fined 3.6 billion euros between DOJ, PNF and the SFO. And the company I blew the whistle on have just declared guilty of corruption and been fined £30 million.
Wow.
So I'm researching a PhD. Well, thank you. We haven't quite finished. We got a little bit to go, but we're almost there. I'm researching a PhD into why people do not blow the whistle. And we can talk about that and how we're doing that. I'm almost at the end of my thesis, so I think I know the answer to that one. So there we go. The other thing we've done, and we can talk about it in a moment, is we've started a charity called Parrhesia, and we intend to turn that into the Parrhesia Institute, looking at the promotion and advancement of education by research and practice to better improve the advice to policymakers to change the law to protect whistleblowers going forward. So that's where we are now. Okay,
and James, you want to introduce yourself briefly and tell us what your research has been about?
Sure. My name's James Killen. Like Ian, I was in the British Army. I worked in the mental health services as a captain. My whistleblowing experience was as a junior officer in British Forces Germany, looking after British Army, Air Force personnel and their families, but seconded to a civilian contractor out there who's providing very poor care. So I whistleblew that and was threatened with court-martial in the end, but it all went away finally. I left about 3 years ago and completed a master's, and I'm now doing a PhD at the University of York, looking at moral injury in human rights defenders and looking at the use of lawfare, so using the law to silence that group of people so they can't come forward and continue doing their human rights work, but also looking at peer support and how peer support in particular amongst geographically disparate groups of defenders can be used to alleviate some of the symptoms that we know about with moral injury.
Thank you. And Christian, in the place of Dr. Buckley, can you give us just a quick hello?
Hi, I am Christian and I identify as a whistleblower, and I've been working with Jackie for the last couple of years. And I know as we get further into the conference, we'll dive into different aspects of that. But I'm super excited about today's conference and all these panels. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. All right. So James, I want to start with you because I think you've spent some time studying whistleblower retaliation. And we've had lots of conversation about moral injury in this population and how the mental health diagnosis is a catch-22. And you just used the term lawfare. So that sounded really interesting to me. So I was going to ask you to, as briefly as you can, give us an overview of those concepts.
So the catch-22, I suppose, is where you've got you have the individuals on one hand who want to avoid the stigma associated with a mental health diagnosis, because that can be used then by organisations to undermine their credibility and the position that they have, undermine even the credibility of their concerns that they're raising. And certainly that's a very easy way to attack somebody, and especially if they're coming forward and being honest. And what you find usually is whistleblowers, once they've reached that kind of initial, once they've stood their head above the parapet, I suppose, the honesty, being open is one of the things that people are sort of known for, and the mental health side of it can be very difficult to then avoid. So the catch-22 is wanting then to get support and help for something, but also not wanting a mental health diagnosis, recognizing that you need support and you're having effect because of the retaliation, but not wanting to go get support. And then later on down the line, that catch-22 comes in again, because moral injury isn't really, and depending on the jurisdiction, I know you and I have talked about this a lot, how you are then able to award damages for that retaliation. How does that work? Because if you're holding on to the idea that moral injury is the label you want to use for the reaction to retaliation, that's not recognized in any diagnostic manual. So you can't hold on to that label at the moment in courts to have any kind of financial reward. You need to go through either PTSD or other sorts of diagnoses as a result of that retaliation, so maybe depression or a result of substance misuse. That's very difficult. So without specific offences for retaliation that point to particular acts that have happened, you're reliant then on using resultant mental health effects to try and get some form of compensation or remedy for the impact of that retaliation. So lawfare is a slightly different concept, and that's the use of essentially the criminal justice system or even employment law or civil law more widely as a way of putting pressure on an individual to stop doing the human rights work. And whistleblowing often falls into that umbrella of human rights work. So you find in less reputable countries, shall we say, so say Belarus, you'd find journalists being arrested for participation in protests that weren't sanctioned. And that's a way of the state legitimizing that retaliation by the use of the law. With larger organizations we've just heard the Congresswoman talk about how the law is failing in certain areas. And those loopholes can be used by organizations to maneuver people into a position where they don't have the benefit of the law to enforce their rights. And that's another way of the law being used to essentially silence people from doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of doing the right thing.
I find that really interesting. And I see all the time and hear that catch-22, because people are really terrified of going to get mental health, even though they need it, because they're fearful that if those records get discovered by their organization, that will be weaponized and used against them to say, well, see, this person is incredible because they need to see a psychiatrist. So Christian, from your experience, and we've had a lot of experience mentoring people over the last few years, can you give us some examples of retaliation that those you have mentored have experienced, and how are those tactics harmful?
So I think in the whistleblowing community, we see a lot of different tactics used. Typically, it starts out with during the course of work. So you're reassigned assignments, or the assignments that you're given are devalued. So I've seen individuals demoted. It might not impact their pay, but it does impact their position and how they view themselves and the feedback they're receiving from their supervisors regarding their work, which can undercut the value of work itself. We've also seen individuals who've experienced retaliation in much more egregious forms, in the sense that they're concerned for their family, or have been stalked in the community, or feel the need to place cameras around their house. There's also been incidences of where personal information has been released on an open court record as
doxing.
Yeah, as a way of almost faultless retaliation, because I don't think people realize that the courts are not technically, do not have to be compliant with HIPAA. So for individuals who worked in the community in the human rights sector, or for instance, child welfare, highly visible to community members, and people are following the events of their case. And given the events of their case, finding personal information can be an immediate safety concern for our whistleblowers. We've also seen whistleblowers caught in that mental health barrier that you guys were talking about, of understanding the need for it, but such a hesitancy, because real true safety concerns, especially for people who understand their field, can come off as paranoia to individuals who are not participating in that particular expertise. And so whistleblowers are very concerned about getting the wrong diagnosis or being discredited because they sought mental health. And so we as clinicians, because I am a clinical social worker, we're trying to kind of support this field of knowledge and create a space, a safe space for whistleblowers, so they can come to practitioners who really understand the psychological, emotional, physical impact of whistleblowing and some of the safety and risk concerns associated with it.
All right, thank you. Yes, those are some really great examples. So Ian, you developed Parrhesia to help promote whistleblower research. What are the main elements that you see needing research? And can you tell us a little bit about the body of research that you think is needed to better inform policies?
Yeah, I'm going to use my own findings out of my research to actually answer that question, because it's new research, it's original, and it's I don't think there's very much evidence of empirical evidence out there as to why people don't blow the whistle. If I can just share my screen with you, if Paul can allow that. If Paul can just enable screen sharing for me.
Sure. That's going to take a second.
Hopefully.
Do you already have the option at the bottom of the screen? Do you have the screen share?
Yeah, but it tells me that host disabled participant screen sharing. So
okay, give me a second.
Whoever the host is has to just enable that, if you will. I'm sure I'm not going to be the only one today who wants to share some slides with you.
Is it possible that we make him temporary co-host so that he can just share his screen?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Let me see if I can.
You've done this before, Christian.
Okay, so I can make him a co-host.
That's great.
And there, now you should be able to, that might be easier.
Super. Okay.
There we go. Oh, wow.
There you go. It looks complicated, but it's not. What I'm showing you is what's called an Ishikawa diagram. Ishikawa was the father of total quality management, which is a manufacturing tool. And what he did was he said, you know, let's go and look at the causes of what goes wrong in a manufacturing system and then keep burrowing down. It's called the 5 whys. So you keep asking why. And then you aggregate the data into what he calls a fishbone diagram. So the bones of the fish are the actual reasons that people gave me. Although some of them are just explanations or covering reasons because they don't want to admit or they feel guilty as to why they didn't do what they might have done. And then when we aggregate those down, actually it comes into 5 major areas of what I call the root causes. And the root causes of why people don't speak up are primarily fear for their job and their income and the stress it brings and the disturbance it does to the family. And secondly, an area called ineffectiveness. They don't think they're going to be effective. And that means, you know, they don't tread in the minefield because they're not going to get to the other side. They're just going to get their legs blown off. So they don't do it. And the third area is this one over here. It's where they take alternative action. They're not brave enough to blow the whistle, but they find some other way of passive resistance or losing an invoice, losing a file, making sure that something doesn't happen. The other 4th reason is that either they are absolutely corrupt, they're taking the brown envelope, or they're complicit, or they believe they're complicit because they've been drawn into it to such an extent that they think that they're going to get prosecuted if the whistle is blown. And the last reason is the political, strategic, or economic reason. It's what is called the consequentialist view. The greater good is worth getting your hands dirty for. Now, what that causes is individual silence, and the accumulation of individual silence produces organizational silence, and the organizational silence, when it's accumulated, creates a culture of silence. And what that then tracks back to is that if you're in a culture of silence, it actually then serves to pre-program other people not to speak up either. And so we have a vicious circle that keeps going round because it's not broken. And it's only broken when a whistleblower comes forward. And I give you the idea of John Stuart Mill that bad men only need good men to do nothing for them to propagate. It takes someone unusual, someone extraordinary to stand out and speak up and take that vital step for actually bad guys to get stopped. Now, this idea came out with Foucault, and he found it actually in 405 BC in a play by Euripides, where the powerful king offers protection to the herdsman because he recognizes that he doesn't have the truth. So whistleblowing's not new. It's been going on for 2,500 years, if not before.
Right.
You know, and this play was used as a way of teaching citizens moral responsibility in government. Now, Michel Foucault looked at this in the 1990s, and he actually pointed out that within Parrhesia there are 3 key elements: the speaker, the whistleblower, the truth, the information being passed, and the listener. And if you analyze each of those, they each have a key part to play. But actually, I think Foucault didn't go far enough. There's another bunch of people, and that's the other observers, because around the speaker and the listener, and watching what happens to the speaker and what the listener does to them, are all these other people. And the response that they give either reinforces the idea that you can speak up and be heard and be safe, or it acts as a deterrent. And the current climate, certainly in our part of the world, I think you in America lead us, but you know, we can still improve, is a deterrent. You know, most people get shot for actually speaking the truth. So what we need to do is return to this idea of a Parrhesiastic contract. And this very much parallels what you're doing with the workplace promise. You know, it's returning to this idea that we should have a moral contract between the organization and the individual, between the employer and the employee, because that's the grounds upon which we engage to work. I'll work for you, but it must be legal, it must be moral, and if something goes wrong, I have a right to turn around and say it's going wrong, and you have a duty to turn around and listen to me and fix it. And that's where it's breaking down at the moment. So what we want to do in parallel to yourself is return to this idea of a parrhesiastic contract. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. That was very informative. I think the model and the fishbone is something that I think we look at when we talk about continuous process improvement and Deming and Donamedian and some of those other great minds that have looked at what makes an organization do the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. And I think the idea that we need further study on some of these motivations is important. And what motivates fraud and corruption? You know, where does that fit into all of this? Is it bad people doing bad things while good people do nothing? Is it the conspiracy of silence? Or is there really an opportunity and a lack of commitment to truth telling? So I think those things are important. And then for the person who is left, that speaker who gets shot, and I know, well, hopefully you're using that as a euphemism.
It's a metaphor.
But I've said there's more than one way to kill off somebody. You don't have to physically kill them to destroy them. So I think, again, these become those important concepts that I do think we need to research more.
Yeah, I also talk about, and again, this comes out of personal experience and out of observation of others. There are 3 assassins in this process. When you blow the whistle, the first assassin, and it does happen, people do get killed for blowing the whistle. The first assassin is a real assassin. You know, you look at Sergei Magnitsky or Jamal Khashoggi, or there's a young girl, Diana Barala, out of South Africa, who's just been killed for whistleblowing. In fact, Cyril Ramaphosa has just spoken out about it over there, the president of South Africa. So it's a real assassin. The second assassin that comes at you is actually thrown at you by the organization again, and it's the professional career assassin. They destroy your career. They try to take you down by saying that you're a bad employee, or you were a bad manager, or you were a troublemaker. And the whole point of doing that is actually to undermine the credibility of the person. Because if you undermine the credibility of the person, when they become a witness, you tend to then invalidate the information they're trying to say. And so it's a straightforward tactic. And the last set of assassins actually are lawyers, because they throw a whole bunch of lawyers at you. And because the organization has a bottomless pit of money and resources and access to PR and marketing, they try to wear you down in the courts. And even when you take a case against them, they have more money and resources than you. And there's a total inequality of arms when you get into the courtroom. And actually that needs looking at as well within any whistleblower protective system, you know, so that you're on an equal footing when you're arguing your case.
Yes. Yeah, Ian, I see you're getting a lot of comments in the chat. People are agreeing with you.
Oh, great. It's straightforward common sense, born of experience. You know, it's taken me 11 years and we've still got 1 trial to go. So by the time next year happens and it'll be, we get the last bit of the process done, it will be a dozen years. But what I want to prove is that you can blow the whistle, you can take on your own government, the Saudi royal family, Europe's biggest defense manufacturer, and you can win. But you have to have fortitude, and you have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to persuade a lot of people that you were right in the first place.
Right. And I think I think some of the things I want to get into today is sort of the right way and the wrong way to do all of that, and the tactics that are necessary to stay the course, but not become self-defeating and self-harming. Because that, I think, and Christian and I have talked about this a little bit, is we've dealt with people who we go, oh, I see why their organizations are frustrated with them, because they themselves have become so traumatized and they've become such victims. And James, you and I've talked about complex PTSD and those second order of effects. What do you think is a way forward to dealing with complex PTSD, and how do we help people not be so self-defeating and become, I think, what was it that I had a government official tell me that people become professional whistleblowers. They see wrongdoing everywhere. And I'm like, yes, because you've traumatized them. So you've made them hyper-vigilant. So James, what is complex PTSD and what are its effects?
I think everything you've just said, really. I think there's this blurring of the lines between what moral injury is and what complex PTSD is, or what PTSD is in itself. And there are arguments still about one being them either being the same thing, or moral injury is reinventing the real. And I think really, and again, it comes down to again, we've talked about this before, haven't we? How you use PTSD and moral injury in the courts, and which how you use the definitions that are contained in diagnostic manuals. Moral injury and PTSD are different. They have different mechanisms. They're mechanistically different, but it's not to say there aren't overlaps. So it's not to say you can't have guilt and shame with PTSD, and it's not to say you can't have fear with moral injury either. But when it comes to how you can make those better, how you can get people to sort of be more objective, I suppose, is what you're ultimately saying. I mean, the criticism of people becoming professional whistleblowers is essentially a comment on how they've become, as you've said, hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant of wrongdoing. So they react more strongly to any minor thing than they might otherwise have done. Essentially, that only really comes about through integrating their experience within their own personal narrative, and that comes through therapy, peer work. Moral injury talks a lot about a forgiveness process. So where there are feelings of guilt or shame, I guess predominantly for their own actions, whether that's being part of an organization that they thought was good and now realize that isn't, or whether it's they've whistleblown, but the consequences that they didn't foresee have had great impacts on people that they care about or themselves, for example. So they may have brought a detriment onto their family and feel guilty about that, for example. There is a sort of forgiveness process, and a lot of the literature talks about is based on the armed forces, so the use of chaplains, not necessarily approaching this issue from a faith perspective, but in the armed forces, if you need to find someone to talk about forgiveness, you pass it on to the padre, don't you? So, but I think there's a utility in that, and the potential problematic nature of bringing religion and faith into it aside, there is something about a sort of secular forgiveness process that I think is really worthwhile. And I think it's either Nash or Litz that talks about this need for a secular forgiveness process. So essentially, I don't think even finding resolution, or finding that sense of justice will bring that integration in. I think it's really the need to explore what's happened and make sense of it in a way that allows you to integrate it, which then brings about that reduction in that symptom. We're essentially talking about a post-trauma symptom. We are talking about post-trauma symptom of this hyper-vigilance, this sort of knee-jerk reaction to every little thing, where people objectively looking in would describe that reaction as an overreaction to the set of circumstances that the whistleblower has been presented with.
So would you see, so you're reminding me that I think there are some things that that happen to people that cause them to become hypervigilant, like the gaslighting and the mobbing and the shunning. Are there,
sure.
Do you see the threads of those tactics? How do we sort of pull the string?
I mean, it's that sense of betrayal, and you can use, I've used the model before, it's Betrayal Fear's model of the whistleblowing process. You can look, in fact, I can do I've got slides if you want, which I've used previously on my, to see if that works. Is it going to let me do it? Does that come up?
Yes.
Sure, there we go. So these are the stages of the whistleblowing process that Betrayal and Near talk about. And you can look at the different stages and look at places where there would be these, what the literature calls potentially morally injurious events. And there's also a sort of, there's a fifth version, if you like, if I can get Google, there we go. This rehabilitation, so you've gone through the whole process and you've rehabilitated, and then there's this idea of social misrecognition as well that Tina Mollinger from the Netherlands talks about. And this idea that the view of society, and in this instance, she's talking about Dutch peacekeepers in Bosnia, the way that society views a particular population and how it misrecognizes a particular population. And we've all heard experiences, you see it in the news all the time, about how whistleblowers are often miscategorized as either troublemakers or heroes or whatever. That in itself can be morally injurious. But essentially, I think the biggest problem, I think the greatest sort of the greatest force, I suppose, feelings of betrayal. Feelings of betrayal is probably where the hypervigilance comes from the most. And you can look through the different stages of the whistleblowing process and find out where there'll be sort of highlight where it's likely to have those feelings of betrayal. So it could be where the wrongdoing occurs. It could be during stage 2. It could be anywhere around it. But if you're looking to get a sense of, if you're looking to try and prevent this in the future, you can look at that. But if you're trying to provide support to whistleblowers, it's a good idea to try and find a framework to understand their experience, and where it's useful then to sort of hone in and find and sort of tease out that narrative and look at where those senses are. Using the framework can be helpful for doing that. So yeah, I think I think that answers your question. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. It does. And I think I think you hit on a key concept. And I know Christian and I have talked also about this building trust and the betrayal of trust. And I think that's where some of the ostracism and the shunning is really so hurtful, is because people feel so betrayed by their organization that they've worked so hard for, and their sense of mission. They lose that betrayal and that loss of, and the loss of the friendships and the coworkers, I think are really significant. And so I think the betrayal issues that you just brought up are something that we do need to maybe look at and look at more deeply. I think it was something that when Jonathan Shea talked about the undoing of character, he saw the root of that was the loss of trust and the feeling betrayed, and just how emotionally impacting that is for human beings. I think it's what makes us the most angry and the most sad.
Sure. And in terms of symptomology, I suppose the hyper-vigilance comes from that wanting to avoid that sense of betrayal in the future. So you see a potential wrongdoing and what you know from your own experience, what that entails. And there's that sense of wanting to avoid that sense of betrayal again in the future because of everything else that comes along with that, but also not just avoid it, sometimes to attack it. So there's a fight-flight response. You either run away from the danger or you throw everything at it. And that's where you can almost get that that professional whistleblower, that hypervigilance, that reacting more strongly than you otherwise might. Comes, I think, from that lack of integration of that experience of betrayal, what it means. You know, we're talking about schemas then, aren't we, with how you view yourself and how you view other people, how you integrate that then, so there's not that kind of there's that contradiction that you're holding on to. There's a way of merging the two, so it forms one singular narrative that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think I'm seeing also some things in the chat, and people
oh my goodness,
yeah, there's a lot of comments.
Yeah,
there's
sorry, Joe Plensler, I hope you're pronouncing your name right. David Dr. Rott discusses terms of amygdala triggers. There's also really good Barnes, Hurley, and Tabor talk about moral injury and PTSD, and they go into, they've done MRI scans on the brain where they get people to reflect or produce an emotional narrative of their own experiences and then look at how the brain reacts, and to look at the different parts of the brain that are triggered when looking at morally injurious events that they've described, where there's our feelings of guilt and shame, but also betrayal, and then fear-based with PTSD, or what we more classically call PTSD. And there is a danger of separating the two and sort of be reductionist in that regard. You've got to remember that there are overlaps, but it's helpful then to sort of look at, from a neurological point of view, how the brain is effective when we're looking at these morally injurious events, and how that can then produce sort of post-traumatic symptoms, and then that has an impact then on how we bring that to treat it, but B, when we're looking at remedy for retaliation, how we can make right the detriment that whistleblowers have faced through the courts.
Yeah, so just as a reminder, I am seeing a lot of comments in the chat. Certainly, if you have a question that you want to put in the chat, or use the Q&A function on the bottom part of your screen, we are willing to take some questions from the audience. So I appreciate all that's going on in the chat right now. I think that there's been lots of great comments, and I love that people have been sort of sharing some of their own resources and some of their own personal experiences. So speaking of personal experiences, Christian, what do you think we could do to better understand some of the propensity for whistleblowing? And again, I think there's this idea of what makes somebody a whistleblower, what makes somebody a bystander, what makes somebody a perpetrator, a co-conspirator, a cautionist, a ghoster. I mean, we've been using these terms around the workplace. And so I thought, what would be, what are some of the things and some of the research in terms of treating some of this that you think are areas that might need further study, or where are we doing well?
Well, that's a very large question for me.
Well, I was trying to give you time to think about the answer.
Well, actually, so one of the things that I wanted to chime in about James and Ian is I've also, during working with Jackie and seeing other whistleblowers and going to events, we found this population of whistleblowers that are unintentional whistleblowers, or whistleblowers who didn't know they were whistleblowers until later because they were experts at their career. They were doing what they were paid to do. When they were asked a very direct question, they were ready to die on that hill just because of the fact they knew the subject in and out, right? They were the subject matter experts. And so the only distinction was the message that used to be welcome was no longer welcome. Sometimes that's a shift in leadership, and or just position changes or job changes or political changes. And so I think for those of us who plan to be whistleblowers, the punch doesn't hurt less just because you know it's coming, but at least you were able to plan and make sure that you remained healthy as you move forward. I think that the current literature and where we're at in whistleblowing is we're very new. We're in a very new space for recognizing the psychological impact of whistleblowing on the community and the fallout from whistleblowing. I think currently what this conference is attempting to do is provide a safe space and grow on the education for whistleblowers themselves, supporters of whistleblowers, and also practitioners. So lawyers and other individuals who are helping to make this a real community. I think it's important for our practitioners to understand that safety always has to be assessed for whistleblowers, and safety looks different for every person. So I think currently we need more verbiage and words to create a common space, which is why I'm very appreciative of Jackie's book. Even as a clinician, I've realized I've always used those terms for someone else, and I didn't think about the impact on myself as an individual. So I think that's somewhere where that we need to grow. We also need to grow in our screening process of whistleblowers, because one of my lawyers will always say that even whistleblowers who are winning their litigation will drop out due to just the overwhelming impact on their life. So we need to be able to create this real space. And I think the mentoring portion of it is super impactful in the fact that you know you're not alone. And that's why I have become a huge supporter of this organization, is that being able to have a shared experience. One of the verbiages that I've used in my journey is a lot of people will say, Christian, I can't do what you did because I have to feed my family. And so my response was to use that same hierarchy of needs to answer that question and say, I needed to sleep. I needed to look at myself in the mirror. I needed to be able to live with myself. And even though I do have an importance on financial survival, that was not my motivator, because many people have to make individual aspects or decisions around their own process. So I think for the literature, I'm super excited to see James and Ian's work. I think it's much needed. I think we need to train our practitioners, our supporters, and even our family members need a better understanding of what we're going through so that we remain stable through this journey. I hope that answers the very large question you asked me.
No, it does. And I wanted to take a moment and note that we have our first question from the audience, from Dr. Kernan Mannion. I believe this is going to be for James, but feel free to chime in, Ian, as well. Jonathan Shea asserts, I believe correctly, that moral injury alters character virtually indelibly. In this way, it's more detrimental than even PTSD. Please share your thoughts about remedying the impact of moral injury.
That is another huge question, isn't it? I think, Kernan, I don't know what you're an MD in, hopefully not psychiatry, so you don't then shoot me down. But I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think it's difficult because the labels that we use, PTSD, moral injury, complex PTSD, we tend to use them in different ways, and the diagnostic manuals, even very recently, have been in what was classed PTSD and CPTSD before, with the new ICD and the new DSM, and we don't really have an agreed definition of what moral injury is as well. Either. We used to call, there used to be a diagnosis of enduring personality change as a result of trauma. That was in, I think, the ICD-10. I've lost the question. Where has it gone? Hang on a second, before I go rattling on. So I don't know whether it's even more detrimental than PTSD. What is true, I think, is that there are a subset of people who do have this enduring reaction to these events, and it does change people. But then I suppose that what is the so what of that? That lots of things in life change people. When you have children, that changes how you view the world and how you react, and the responsibilities you then sort of take on and what have you. When you get married, etc., etc. So there's nothing necessarily intrinsically wrong or bad that there are changes in personality in of itself as a result of an act. It depends, I suppose, what the effect that has on the individual, and if
well, can that effect be treated? I think it's really the...
So to go back to, so I suppose it's tricky, isn't it? I don't the literature is still working that out. There's use of current PTSD talking therapies. So prolonged exposure has been used as one. example. If you look at the, I shared it to the group a second ago, the one that looks at the mechanism between the two, between moral injury and PTSD. It describes some of the treatment processes in there that are having some efficacy with moral injury, mainly because they're taking away some of the symptoms of PTSD. And once you're getting away from some of the symptoms of PTSD, that allows you then to explore the moral injury side of it without the reactions that the symptoms of PTSD might necessarily sort of bring out. So what I mean, there isn't that sort of hyper arousal because you're trying to talk about an event, because you've sort of re-exposed the person through using PTSD talking therapies. But so what I'd say is I wouldn't necessarily shy away from that. I mean, I had a sergeant major from when I went through the Royal Academy at Sandhurst, who was involved on a blue on blue incident, actually, where an Apache helicopter accidentally targeted the wrong compound, and it's a compound that he was in with his soldiers. He's now a priest. That's how he has integrated that, the problems that arose from that, how he's integrated that in his, and found sense of that situation, and been able to live a happy life, because he's completely changed from being a soldier, sergeant major, commissioned from the ranks, and as a late entry captain and what have you. He left the army and studied for the priesthood. So I'm not saying that's the treatment for everybody. I guess what I'm saying is it's probably a case-by-case basis, because moral injury is based on, you know, morally held beliefs and expectations that each one of us hold, and they are different for everybody. So I guess that's why the literature talks about the need to develop this area more and more, is because in ways that are probably quite different to standard treatments with PTSD, moral injury is talking about individuals' moral compasses, and I suppose they're probably, there's an argument to make that they're more unique than, you know, how everybody else's amygdala works, for example. So
no, I agree, and I think what you're teasing out here is when we talk about trauma, we're always talking about the perception of the individual. You can have two people exposed to combat and have them walk away with very different reactions. You know, one person is, oh my God, I almost died. And the other person is, I almost died.
Yeah,
and
sure.
It's the same situation, two very different directions for that response.
And that's why we talk about they're potentially morally injurious events, right? They're not morally injurious events, because you can have an event that is morally injurious for one person, but for somebody else doesn't affect them at all. You know, they shrug their shoulders and say, "C'est la vie." And then PTSD, you can have a trauma where one person is, you know, recocking a rifle and jumping up and advancing forward, and the other person's shaking and terrified. So I'm afraid that probably it's one of those wishy-washy, lawyery, clinician, researcher type answers of sort of, it depends, or we don't know yet, isn't it really? But that's essentially where we're at.
Well, no, and I agree. I mean, and we're talking about this, and we're using examples from combat veterans, because that's mostly the field of study for moral injury. I mean, I think that's why what you're doing and what Ian's doing to advance the field, to bring this level of study on moral injury to the employment space and whistleblowers, I think is important. Ian, did you want to add on to any of that? I know it was a lot.
I wanted to pick up actually on because I'm not the expert on moral injury, James is, on something that Christian said about being a victim, and about the major thing that helps you survive the whistleblowing experience. And I came into this area when I researched my master's, looking at stigma as it's applied to whistleblowers, and looking at the survival strategies that whistleblowers employ in order to live through the process. And what became apparent was that the key factor was the closeness of support by their spouse or partner, and the close circuit of friends and family, and sometimes colleagues, because a lot of work colleagues jump to one side because it's too dangerous for them. But those colleagues who do come back and lend moral and sometimes physical support are absolutely vital to the process. not only the process of survival, but the process of rehabilitation and recovery, you know, finding your place back in the world and back in the employment market. And it could be just that you know, it's the offer of a job, or the helping hand in finding another job, or even just a phone call is enough on a dark day to actually pick you back up and put you back on your feet again. And those of us who have been through the experience know that you have enough of those, that when someone actually quietly says, you know, don't worry, mate, I'm with you. I support what you've done. I understand why you did it. And if there's anything I can do, then let me know. That's when the real friends and supporters become an absolute rock of stability in your life. And out of that, someone heard me talk, a professor out of the National University of Ireland in Galway, a lady called Kate Kenny, Professor Kate Kenny. And Kate and another professor, Mariana Fataki, put together a study. I don't know if you've seen it. I actually have a copy of it. I couldn't find it.
Yes, is that on the economic impact? Is that the?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just economic impact. It does touch on economic impact, but it touches on the personal impact as well, and looks at the survival strategies. And they kind of expanded on stuff that I was doing, and did it a lot more professionally, because they're, you know, real academics as opposed to student academics. And it's a fantastic study. And if I can, I'll dig out the link and I'll put it on the chat line.
Yeah, you know, you just read my mind, because I was going to ask if you could do that, because we are trying to make sure that we are providing our viewers and attendees with as many resources as we can. And that is a great study. I have seen it. It provides a lot of really good information. And so in following to that a little bit, Tracy Haigh, Haigh, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, so I apologize. But Tracy is asking, and I'm guessing she's a fellow Brit, because she's asking if the research that Ian and James are presenting could be used at whistleblower tribunals. And I mean, I from a personal perspective, I'd like to answer that, but I think that is the idea, is that the organizing and creating a school of research for whistleblower retaliation and the harm that it causes. I mean, certainly the goal with my book is for us to be able to use this research for court cases. But I'm going to let Ian and James talk more about tribunals in the UK, because that's not my area of specialization. Although we've had cases in the UK right now, and we've been asked to help on some of those cases as well. And I've been happy to do it. So,
okay.
But you guys are more than knowledgeable experts on tribunals.
Well, I'll answer the question in three fashions, really. The first is that when I went to the Employment Tribunal, I didn't have a body of research to put my hand on. I relied on my lawyers to fight us through the process, and I think that'll probably be the way with most of you. The second thing is that we have set up within Parrhesia, the whole point of setting up Parrhesia was to create a body of knowledge, an accessible body of knowledge and expertise that could be offered to policymakers to change the law, because that's where they go. I mean, you only have to look at COVID and see that, you know, the politicians turn to the scientist and get the professor of this, that, or the other to stand up and give them the scientific evidence. Well, the same with politicians in changing legislation around employment law and whistleblower protection. You know, they rely on think tanks and academics. So we've gathered together the leading academics in this country to feed that expertise directly into the policymakers. And secondly, what we're doing now is, it's actually on the side of the desk here, is to actually put together something which we'll put online of the knowledge base. Those immediate areas of training and areas of research and areas of publication that we can immediately put our hands on. And what we intend to do is actually build that into the website so that people can go there and look at different topics. And of course, you've got a bit of work to do in putting a search engine behind it. So you put in a keyword and it finds the different relevant documents. So that's an advancement that we're going to make on the website. Now, what was the other bit? A bit about our thesis and our work, can it be used at whistleblower tribunals? You have to wait until it's published. You know, a thesis by a student academic, no matter he's got grey hair and he's an old and bold, you know, I'm still a student. Yes, I've got a master's, and that's published. You can refer to that, and you can refer to that publication. It's been reviewed by the university. It's been given the tick in the box. But the PhD stuff will have to wait until the thesis is published post-graduation. And I'm aiming for, I mean, I've got till October next year, but I'm actually aiming for Easter next year. So hopefully by then you can use it.
That's an important point, because we forget that when we do take cases to court, that the evidence we use, there is some, and again, trying to expand on that, the things that are in the public domain, things that we can access. There's lots of research studies that document what is trauma, what's a serious injury for PTSD. And we understand and we recognize that emotional abuse, what in the workplace we usually refer to as retaliation, harassment, discrimination, is really emotional abuse. And the literature really is fraught with case studies and documentation in domestic violence and other situations where there is emotional abuse, that literature exists. And we've also been putting what we think meets the criteria for the whistleblower protection advocate. We have links for that on our website as well that we can share more of, and that Christian is going to talk a little bit more about over lunch, is that those things, what we considered are the 10 hours for that. So, and our peer support model, I should say, is an evidence-based approach. There's been lots of research and study on the use of peer support over the years. I've used it dozens and dozens of times with Vietnam combat veterans. I ran a program in the former Soviet Union with their veterans who served in Afghanistan. We were teaching peer support skills even then. And then, of course, I've used these skills and techniques at the Pentagon. There are some great other programs that are peer support. Vets for Warriors, NAMI, the VA hires peer support counselors. There is a body of evidence. I think the TRIM program in the UK, I think James, even maybe you're familiar with it as well, but James and I talked about TRIM the other day. I forget what it stands for. But it's like a critical incident stress debriefing model. There are types of programs, types of models for peer support, and many of them have been studied and provide some evidence for very useful techniques and interventions, not the same as, you know, like cognitive behavioral therapy, the CBT, or emotional freedom technique, EMDR. I mean, there are other interventions that have been researched that are clinician or clinically evidenced research. This is also got evidence behind it. It's just a different kind of technique and intervention. I mean, I love what Ian said earlier about, you know, that one phone call can make a difference. And we know that with suicide prevention, that one phone call can really make a difference for somebody who is in a dark, sad place and feeling lonely and isolated, becoming depressed, suicidal, maybe drinking too much alcohol. That just knowing that people care about you and are willing to reach out, call you, let's have coffee, let's go have lunch. I mean, those are simple things that become part of this support system and life validating means of bringing people out of that depression and sadness, and becomes part of a strategy that that we talk about. That is, we'll be talking later about my book and the peer support and the intervention techniques that are important. So I think these are great questions and important things for us to think about. And before we take other questions, though, and before I forget, I wanted to ask Ian, and maybe we can turn our attention to some of the policies, because I think that's what Tracy is asking when she says, can we bring this research into these tribunals? Can we change policy that recognizes that harm is being done by whistleblower retaliation? And can we bring compensatory damages into the law? And I know there have been multiple views on that. There are those who have said, oh no, whistleblowers are bounty hunters and that's all they're in it for. And yet those of us as clinicians, and I see Christian just had a head jerk reaction, that as clinicians, we know trauma is trauma, and that we need to have mental health parity so that we treat emotional and psychological trauma in the same way we do physical trauma. So Ian, what are your thoughts about policy and bringing that change to tribunals, but to legislative bodies?
Well, I think I want to start with let's go back to the three, or what I call the four elements within Parrhesia. The speaker, the truth, the listener, and the observers. And I'm going to look at the listeners, because the key element in the whole process is how the listeners not just hear, but react to what you're saying. It's a response they give you that either embraces you within the organization as a good colleague and employee who has actually done the right thing to point out wrongdoing, or mismanagement, or abuse, or whatever you want to call it. But that's a good act, and their recognition of that. Or their response that you are disloyal and you are a troublemaker and you're raising issues that they're uncomfortable with and are best left quietly to one side. And therefore they attack you because of it. I mean, that kind of response is what drives people outside of an organization to become external whistleblowers. And there are two types. There are internal whistleblowers. And if you get a bad response, you become an external whistleblower. And that becomes then an adversarial relationship. And that then tends to drive towards the employment tribunal or the courts, or both. So it's the response of the organization which is absolutely key. And really what we need is a change in the culture where the organization automatically thinks of the person who's speaking up as a friend of the organization. If you're a parent, and most of us at our age tend to be, or grandparents, we teach our children to actually, if something's going wrong, if someone's harming you, if someone is asking you to do something that you really don't want to do, or you feel very nervous about, we say to them, come and tell me, I'm the adult. I'm the person who's meant to be the guardian, the protector. I'm the one who gives you food and drink and love and attention and protection. You can come to me because I will protect you. So why are we any different when we grow up and we go into the working world and the organization takes the part of the adult, the protector and the provider and the source of wisdom and the source of protection? And something goes wrong, we go to them and they don't respond. I mean, if my children were finding something wrong and coming to me and saying, Daddy, this man is trying to make me do something I don't want to do. If I hit them, they're not going to come to me again. And their brothers and sisters are not going to come to me and tell me when something's going wrong. So why is it different in the working world? People are people. They learn it from their mother's knee. It's how we drive society. It's how we teach people how to behave. And we shouldn't change just because we go into a bigger and wider family. So, and then we have the observation. I talk about the brothers and sisters observing. If the observation of how others are treated is really a kind of indicator of how you're going to be treated. And that's what we need to point out to the politicians, that, you know, it's all jolly good about standing on a platform and going for votes and saying, I will protect you, I will stand for law and order. But when you get there, if you don't stand for law and order, if you don't protect the people who come forward, the others won't come forward. And therefore, your vicious circle that we talked about earlier will continue. I was at a conference earlier this week, the International Symposium on Economic Crime. And I don't know if you know, but fraud is almost 50% of all crime happening in the world at the moment. Almost 50%, driven by the internet, driven by COVID, driven by cryptocurrencies and all the fraud that goes with it. You know, I'm sure we're not alone in our country of someone ringing up and saying, I can help you with your pension. Give me your details of your bank account, you know.
Yeah.
It's not just a Nigerian prince trying to tell you you've inherited a whole load of money anymore.
Yes, that Nigerian prince is busy. And we get calls like that too, about, you know,
sure.
your car insurance or your student loan. So you're right. We're all attacked by fraud at least once a week, and whether we realize that or not.
Well, it's now almost 50% of all crime. It costs 3.7 trillion per year. Now, a lot of it is born of the fact that we're not combating it in a way where we unveil and reveal the people who are practicing the fraud. And the reason that happens is our mechanisms, not only our communication mechanisms, but our protective wrapper of those who do speak up is not there, or it's insufficient. And then I come back to your second question about not just the protection, but the compensation and reward. And you know, we kind of flinch over this side of the Atlantic. You know, there's a very old British way of, oh no, you can't pay people to give you information about baddies. Well, you guys have got that sorted with your Dodd-Frank and your SEC.
Yes, the SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley.
Yeah. And you've got your False Claims Act, and you've got your Sarbanes-Oxley, and you've got your Dodd-Frank, and you've got your qui tam. I mean, you've got a number of mechanisms. We gave up qui tam. We started it in the 13th century, and we gave it up in 1951. I mean, there we go. We need to rejuvenate that idea. And the idea, if it's unpalatable to talk about a reward for coming forward, actually, I have to question whether you really need a reward, because A, people will want to come forward because they offend their morals and their values anyway. And what they want, what whistleblowers really want, is they want to return to the status quo with the wrongdoing remediated.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't do that because when wrong happens to them, there is a detriment that comes with them. They lose their job, they lose their pay, they lose their savings, and it's a vicious circle going downwards. If we had a process of proper compensation, which encapsulated all the detriment that a whistleblower goes through, would you actually need a financial reward as well? I put it to you that you don't.
I think that's an important point that I want to pause on, because I think there are two different things in play here. One is the reward for the whistleblowing and the information. The other is the compensation for the damages caused by the retaliation. So these are two different tracks for do we do one, the other, or both?
Well, I think let's take it in process first. The first one's the compensation for the detriment that you go through. I think that is right and proper, and there should be no question that if you suffer detriment, you should be compensated for it. And then we come on to your point about the quality of the information. if it serves as a means of getting people to come forward to counter the detriment that you might go through, and therefore the deterrent that you might feel, if it pushes you to that extra bit of courage to step into the minefield, then yeah, why not? Why not? But you have to have a system whereby the information you give, its value, how far you have to step into the minefield, all of that, what possible adverse detriments you face, all of that has to be wrapped into some form of scale so that it's a reward that befits the courage that was employed and the value of the information. And I think I haven't actually seen the algorithm, but I'm sure there's an algorithm that someone could work up. You know, there's a book by Lepora and Goodin called if I could even look it up actually, called On Complicity and Compromise, published in 2013. And what they have within that is actually an algorithm for blameworthiness, because they're looking at the crime, you know, and it comes down to how big, how often, and what's the impact of it. But I think if you flip that on its head, you can actually come up with an algorithm of praiseworthiness. You can actually talk about how good people are, the impact of what they've had, how often they've done it, what it took to actually do it. And you could actually come up with a scale, a recognizable scale. I mean, nothing in life is that rigid, but it'll give you a very good guide. Well,
I absolutely think we should do that.
Well, okay, let's do that. You and I, let's do that, shall we? Let's come up with a scale for praiseworthiness, and let's see if we can actually tease that out. And if anyone in the audience is a quantum mechanic, and I mean that in the not in the scientific sense, but in the mathematical sense, who actually help us quantify praiseworthiness, then get in touch and let's do that as a little bit of research.
Sure, you know, we just need a good actuarial.
There's a mathematical and philosophical thesis there for someone who wants to take it on. That'd be great.
So, and you know, as you were talking though, and Christian and I have talked about what she's done in her case, there's, I think, another, so we said there were two types of relief. Christian has fought her case not for herself, but asked for injunctive relief. Can you explain that path, Christian? Like, and what research or what did you use to learn about injunctive relief?
So I chose to pursue injunctive relief in my particular case. I did it very mindful that it might not be able to be obtained through the court process, but I was able to read the politics of the community in that I live and knew that a request of the court would be seen as a stressor. So I work in child welfare, and in the district that I reside, it has been under receivership or federal court monitoring for almost 32 years. This year they entered a stipulation for one more year of oversight. As long as they meet that need and the court orders, they should in theory be out. But I modeled my whistleblowing injunctive relief after the current federal court case, which had a court monitor. So I asked the courts to conduct an investigation through a court monitor of all the ombudsmans within the district to determine if they were adhering to the standards of being an ombudsman. And I asked for remedies through the court. My court case is still in litigation, actually on appeal at the moment. But what it did do was it provided a pressure point where the council members acted. So they understood they would not want a court monitor, and they introduced legislation at my request to remedy the conflict going on within the ombudsman investigatory process. And so now there's legislation that was just recently funded and will turn into an independent office come this fall, actually October 1st. It is turned into a real legislative independent body, which in a way changes the structure of the district's government, because it will be the only investigatory entity that's constituent facing, but it's directly under council for oversight. And so I decided to use injunctive relief as a way of pressuring individuals into doing the right thing and protecting our children. And that legislation is called the Ombudsperson for Children in the District of Columbia.
So I'm really proud of that action, because instead of just thinking about me, myself, and my Christian took what she wanted the courts to do, and that's what injunctive relief is. It sort of goes beyond your own case and what law do you want to change. And I've seen some people do that with their cases, is they ask for not just remediation for themselves, but for the greater good. So what was the whistleblowing trying to accomplish in the first place that never got accomplished? And then how do we use sort of what the literature and what the research tells us is available to change policy and make things happen? So you'll have to certainly keep us appraised for what the next steps are for Parrhesia, and how can we connect some of the literature and the research together.
Well, I think we'd be delighted to. One of the things we're trying to do over here is we're trying to have whistleblowers recognized as victims within criminal cases where they've blown the whistle and suffered reprisal and detriment, but don't always get recognized as victims. And there's a strange clause within our rules of procedure in court procedure here, where unless the victim, the analysis of what happened to them is very, very straightforward and simple, it cannot be heard by the judge in a criminal case, and therefore he can't award compensation. And that needs changing, because, you know, a clever lawyer only has to say to an organization, oh, contest what they're saying, make it complicated, and then the judge won't even get to hear their victim statement. I mean, that's ridiculous. And that means that, you know, people who are trying to do the right thing and become victims as a kind of secondary process never get satisfaction or not rewarded, but they don't get any remedy for what they go through. So that's another area where we're trying to change the law by example to set a precedent that others can follow.
So I want to jump in real quick here, and I actually think it will be a great question for the next panel. In the District of Columbia, the whistleblower law was updated, and in part by GAP, Government Accountability Project, Tom Devine. Essentially what was happening is they wrote a portion of the law that allows a whistleblower to ask for those who impeded upon their whistleblowing to the council members have salary restrictions. And those salary restrictions would mean that district funds could not support those positions. Now, it hasn't necessarily been utilized within litigation yet, because I don't think people really know how to use it. But I think it's an amazing thing to do to hold individuals accountable, because what I hear from whistleblowers consistently is that they feel that the person maintains their job, the person who is retaliating maintains their job, their position, and they continue the behavior even if the individual has won their litigation in whistleblowing. So in the District of Columbia, essentially what would happen is those individuals who impeded on the whistleblower's right to go to DC City Council would no longer be able to be funded by district resources and by default be pushed out of the system. And so I think from whistleblowers' perspective, that is a toxic tactic, or toxic individuals can be removed from the system that they're so severely impeding upon. And that's another aspect in my case that I've kept at the forefront, is not only do we want legislative change, we want individuals who are practicing toxic tactics to not have the same platform or impact on that particular community.
Right, and I think, and we've had some anonymous questions about retaliatory investigations, not interviewing witnesses. I mean, that all becomes part of the attempt to gaslight, marginalize the whistleblower. We don't take them seriously, and therefore, you know, we can minimize what they're disclosing is about. But I think Christian makes a good point. I know we're getting close to time for our break. I haven't seen any new questions either in the chat or in the QA function. But our next panel, I think, will be very appropriate after where we're at with this panel, because it's going to be on the whistleblower protection laws and the forensic evidence needed for damages. And Christian just mentioned GAP. We will have Tom Devine, who is the legal director from GAP, joining us, as well as Jason Zuckerman, Richard Conduit, both attorneys that have had very successful cases. And then for Georgina Halford Hall, Tessa Munt is going to be joining us. So if there are no other questions right now, I'm going to, we'll close out this session. We'll take about a 20-minute break and then come back and for the next session. As a reminder, we are leaving this open so that if you want to stay on this forum and chat, you can raise your hand, I believe, and we will enable some of the microphones so we can do some more chatting. So I think I've got one more question just came in. Oh, so we just have somebody saying that there must be compensation for trauma in the Q&A. So I'm gonna close this session. We'll be switching over to the next session at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you all very much for today. I've appreciated having James and Ian join Christian and I for this, and I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.